Hello there, everybody. It's been a bit of a while, but I'm back. It's KaneFan701, and as you can tell by the title, it's very tragic to hear because last night, on March the 14th, last night, um, WWE legend and two-time Hall of Famer Scott Hall, aka the Razor Ramon, he passed away. He had 3 heart attacks, and he was undergoing a hip surgery, and a blood clot had caused him to have these 3 heart attacks, and he was put on life support, and they did all they could to try and save him. But unfortunately, though, they took him off life support, and it was only going to be a matter of time before Scott was going to go. Tragically, he did so. He went out in his own way, and he's now with all the legends who had passed before him. It is an absolutely tragic and devastating loss. I mean, Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash and X-Pac and other friends who had known Scott Hall very well, and all the fans who knew him, or even myself who grew up watching this guy. He was one of the best entertainers out there. He was also one of the greatest WWE Intercontinental Champions of all time. And of course, he had the most iconic ladder match at WrestleMania 10 in 1994 against the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, which everybody remembers to this day. And I can remember watching it back in that time period because that was the first time I ever saw a ladder match being used in a wrestling ring, especially on the grandest stage of them all at WrestleMania. It was very revolutionary back then. But yeah. I mean, Scott Hall was one of the best, that any talent would ever want to be like. He was basically a quote unquote bad guy that you couldn't boo. You just had to like him. He was like, AK nicknamed the bad guy, you know. And of course, regardless of who he was, he was just one of the best, man. I mean, who can replace someone like him? I mean, he had such a good run in WWE, had some good feuds with Kevin Nash, who was known as Diesel back then. Um, eventually after that, in 1996, they left. In 1996, Scott Hall left the WWE and he went on to go to WCW, and he went by his actual name, Scott Hall. And they actually, they formed the Outsiders, which were just him and Diesel. And eventually, at the Bash at the Beach in 1996, at that same year, the iconic heel turn of Hulk Hogan happened, and they formed the original trio of the NWO, the New World Order. And since then, it just took off and was revolutionized. And then, sometime around 1998 or so, Scott Hall ended up leaving NWO Hollywood, and they ended up going back and joining with Diesel when they came to form another version of the NWO, which was the NWO Wolfpack, which was the black and red variation of the NWO, but was more of somewhat of a face stable, perhaps, maybe. But it really was it was something. But at that time, Scott Hall had his real life issue problems, that he had outside the ring, which really plagued him badly, And that's one of the reasons that led to his demise problems that he had in his actual life. And eventually, when WCW was bought in 2001 by the WWE, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan came back in 2002 at No Way Out. And they still had a bit left in them. And as you all know, eventually Scott Hall had not so much of a good match with Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania 18, but it was still passable for me to enjoy. And of course, Scott sold Austin's Stunner, which was really, really good. And of course, after that, Scott didn't last very long after that. He ended up leaving, shortly after Backlash in that year, and he wasn't seen again for a long, long time until around the time period when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I think it was in the year 2004. Yeah, was it 2004, 13, or 50? Yeah, it must have been 2014. Scott Hall got inducted into the Hall of Fame, and he was like a new, improved man because he took yoga lessons from Diamond Dallas Page, and he looks like a very healthy man again, as if he had surpassed all his demon problems that had plagued him. But over time, Scott eventually aged, and his health was getting onto him. And eventually, the NWO then eventually got inducted into the Hall of Fame, which meant Scott Hall became a two-time Hall of Famer. And eventually, he was loved and by everybody. He had such a good fan base. But and I had the actual pleasure, the honor of actually meeting Scott Hall in 2009 in Birmingham at the NAC. At the memorabilia where I met Ted DiBiase, Virgil, and some of the other TNA guys from Total Nonstop Wrestling as well. And some of the legends were there. I was at the time testing my cosplay as Undertaker back then, which kind of got a passable. Was kind of a passable acceptance, and that's when I got my break for doing the cosplaying for ages. But eventually, all right, this is tough. Damn, this is tough, man. I actually spent some time talking with Scott Hall, getting to know him, and he was such a lovely, lovely person, very well spoken. You know, he was a very understandable human being, and he loved to socialize. He liked anything that was cool, and he thought my cosplay as Undertaker back then was quite impressive, and he appreciated how I looked, and he was just such a nice man, very gentle, and he just loved talking to the fans. He was so sociable. And at one time, actually, when I was there, I sat with him at the bar, having a nice drink with him. As you know, Scott Hall wasn't completely over with his addiction to drinking and having a good time, but he was still controlling his addictions at that point. But he was very well behaved. He was well spoken, and he really just loved to party all night long. He was that type of a man. And eventually, 10 years later on, in 2019, on the exact same day, it was on 2019. It was 2019 when I actually reunited with Scott Hall. But he was with Kevin Nash, Sid, Jimmy Hart, Ric Flair, Eric Bischoff. He was with Bret Hart and Booker T, because they were doing like a WCW reunion thing at the time. It was on the exact same day where I met The Undertaker. And, I was so fortunate to come past him, and he actually remembered me. He recognized who I was. But he was, Kevin Nash was there to say that, he knew who I was as well. But what was really nice about it is that the fact was that Scott never forgot anybody who he remembered talking to and interacting with. But unfortunately, at that time, he had aged pretty well. But as he got older, he was developing some sort of dementia. He had a bit of a dementia problem because he could only remember so many, but he only knows certain people. But he recognized who I was, and got him to shake hands with him, and I even hugged him at one point, telling him that he had left a great legacy and that he will never be forgotten. And I told him that, and he was very honored. And as he said, as he once said in his Hall of Fame speech, bad times do not last, but bad guys always do. That's just the nature of who Scott Hall, aka Razor Ramon, was as the bad guy in his wrestling years. You know, he was all if I can remember, he was one of the few guys who never held the WCW World Heavyweight title, and of course, you know, he held many other titles. He actually held the WCW tag titles. He held the WWE Intercontinental title, which I consider him to be one of the greatest, at that time, because he was one of those mid card players that had it. He was one of the guys. You know, but again, guys, I know this is a difficult thing to talk about because uh, it's a bit tough with me to speak to because I was one of Razor's big fans. Because he was just one of those awesome characters that you would have known and loved. And everybody on social media is just gutted and devastated, and some of them are in tears right now. I mean, heck, even Hulk Hogan was told about it, and he did a little speech, which you can tell he was struggling not to cry too much, but it was very difficult. And Skull, if you're looking down at having me right now, I want to take this time to know that we'll always love you. We will miss you forever. But thank you for everything that you've done in the wrestling business. And thank you for creating good memories. And thank you for what you've done. It was an honor, a blessing, and a privilege to have met you in person, not once, but twice. And to see you wrestle in my hometown in Birmingham against Stone Cold at one of the house shows events at my first WWE event on May 3rd, 2002. Thank you so much, man. We're gonna miss you, brother. Until then, may you rest in peace, Razor Ramon, aka Scott Hall, the bad guy. Rest in peace, Chico.